It's an honor to speak to Fabrizio Celibotti today, who currently holds the chair of macroeconomics and political economy at the University of Zurich, and who's going to give a speech later on about China, convergence, and beyond. Professor Celibotti, most of your research is focused on China and its development process. How does China's success story fit into the general topic of this conference?
Well, I think that it's difficult to think of economic development and economic growth without thinking of China, which has been the most remarkable episode in recent history. I think since the British Industrial Revolution, what we have seen in China is arguably the most phenomenal episode of economic development that has changed the life of millions of people. In spite of all distortion that model can have, we must first of all be admired of what the country has done.
Could you briefly summarize some of the key factors that have played a role in China's development and what other developing countries maybe could learn from that?
Yes, well, clearly there was a sharp acceleration of the growth process starting from the economic reform that were introduced in the late 1970s after the death of Mao Zedong and under the paramount leadership of Deng Xiaoping. These reforms were not intended to be like a major design of changing things, but it was more like an experimentalist strategy, try to see if relaxing some of the constraints that the state intervention imposed on the economy would produce some improvement. China was still at the time one of the poorest countries in the world, was much poorer than Nigeria, than India, than countries that are today significantly poorer than China. So there is no doubt that the process of liberalization that started at the time had an important effect. It was under threat towards the end of the 1980s when there were great social tensions and then the tragedy of Tiananmen that we all remember. Again, the process of market reforms was accelerated in the 1990s, and in the first decade of the 2000, we have seen, with China entering the WTO, a fantastic growth process in the area of 10%. Now, it's always difficult to extrapolate experiences and to say, well, China can be a model for other countries, especially because its institutional setup is unique. So there is no other nation that has experienced this process of fast marketization under the rule of a single country. I mean, Vietnam to some extent has had something similar, but still under the rule of a single party and the absence of democratic institution, and nobody sees even today development that would go in the direction of political changes. So what we can think and discuss is most about economic reforms rather than political reforms. So it's difficult for me to say, well, India should do the same. Certainly there are some lessons, like the establishment of state capacity, not only as an authoritarian machine that controls political stability, but also at the local level. So the ability to do things, to get things done, not without big and widespread corruption, but still China has a peculiar feature relative to other developing countries that things happen. So if something is planned to do, if local authorities want something to happen, by and large it happens. It doesn't get completely wiped out by the process of corruption and appropriation of bribes, etc.
A lot of media outlets have recently raised the question of whether China's growth story has reached its end. Would you agree?
I don't think it has reached an end, but I agree that China is at a turning point, and as in the lecture today I will explain, the mode of growth that has been successful in the last 20 years is unlikely to continue at that speed. there are signs that the economy is slowing down, which is not only the decline of growth rate from 9% to 7 or even 6%, which I would not regard as a concern. In fact, per se, when I talk to policymakers in China, I tell them they should not worry too much about that. But I think that the economy has reached a level of development where firms have to rely on their ability to innovate, to compete. Now the Chinese authority say that they like innovation, but innovation has to happen also on a level playing field in which there is no protection for this or that firm, which is exactly the opposite of the model of growth of China, where essentially everything is driven by specific deals with a firm, with the local government, state-owned enterprise that compete with some advantage in capital markets. So I think that economic reforms have to go deeper. Now the question is whether the political system is capable to produce this transformation. This is a big if, and the risk in the last couple of years is that the obsession with high growth rate and making sure that growth doesn't fall too much induces the political leadership to continue on push and pump resources on projects that have intrinsically a low return. So we continue to see high growth rate, but there is the risk that this is not sustainable in the long run. So there's too much emphasis on investment and too little emphasis on what we call churning competition and the emergence of new firms that can challenge existing ones.
The recent currency devaluation in China has negatively affected some of the major equity markets. Mm-hmm. Are we on the verge of a new systemic crisis?
Again, after the Lehman crisis, one has to be prudent to make these statements, but I don't expect so. I think that the crisis, well, there are two aspects here. One is the devaluation, which comes after a period in which the currency has been appreciating. So there is a sense in which China wants to try to restore export as the engine of growth. I think this is more like a short-term adjustment. The other big news in these days has been the stock market crash. Mm-hmm. And the stock market crash, again, I think it has its own life relative to the real economic performance of China. So we have had the stock market booming during a time in which the Chinese economy wasn't doing particularly great. Now it's falling, and I think that it's a bit the result of somewhat amateurial approach of the Chinese authority to the stock market, and the idea that somehow the Communist Party can do so many things, including ensure investors that the stock market is a safe investment. The stock market is not a safe investment, and it's intrinsically volatile because of the nature of the financial development in China. So this idea that people can become rich by putting more money in the stock market, which has been used as part of the public rhetoric, I think has been very, very unhealthy. And now they essentially don't know how to stop this. And I expect that further adjustment in the asset prices will take place. I don't think this is the sign that the real side of the economy is collapsing.
And as a concluding question, when we're looking at all the problems that China's facing right now and that we just talked about, what can we expect from China's future?
Well, I think that China will continue to grow as a player in the international scene. The new leadership is much more assertive. than the previous one. At some level, this is understandable. We are in a world where there is where there is a monopoly of power with only one superpower. I don't think this is tenable, and this is going to continue. I also think that the United States have not played all well in trying to make the management of the international situation more inclusive. For instance, trying to keep out China from the governance of the IMF and other such episodes. At the same time, one cannot, one feels some concern at seeing the new leadership taking somehow a confrontational attitude with respect to some conflict, mostly local and in the Far East at the moment. My hope is that both China and the US learn how to live in a world where in the future there will be two major powers, and that this process that doesn't lead to further escalation. Of course, much depends on the US elections that are coming up. So, the Obama administration has not step up too much the confrontation, but the risk that some other political leadership in the US does so, that would be very worrisome. Again, I think that in equilibrium we will not see a major military confrontation, but it would be a bad development if we start seeing in the future decades some proxy wars and some of the things we have seen during the Cold War. At local level with the support of different superpowers. So that's the hope is that doesn't happen, of course.
Okay, well, thank you very much for taking the time, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.